Hello and welcome. Well, if you're a parent that at some point has been frustrated, exhausted, and disheartened with the challenges that comes with a child that is a fussy eater, then you're not alone. And if you would love some additional support, well, you're in the right place. Today we speak with our special guest, Marie-France Laval, Dietitian-Nutritionist and Counsellor, originally from France. She's also the CEO of Fussy Eater Solutions, where she offers a range of online and in-home programs to support fussy eaters and their families. And Marie-France will be sharing her expert advice today, how to best manage fussy eaters. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Rachel. I'm really well. And you?
Yes, very excited to be chatting with you. And overall, you've been researching fussy eating for over 15 years now. Initially, and I guess for anyone watching and listening, what brought you to be an expert in this space? We'd love to know a little bit about, I guess, your passion and what was your first encounter with extreme fussy eating?
My first encounter was meeting with my Australian nephews here. I think they were probably about 5 or 6 years of age, and they were struggling, and everybody in the family was anxious and upset at mealtimes. That included my sister-in-law. And then later on, we had family friends whose daughter proved out to be a really extreme fussy eater, but the whole family went through this dynamics of fussy eating for years, and she certainly grew up into an adult who is a fussy eater.
Yes, it's something now. It seems it's becoming more and more evident, I think, with families in time. And I mean, from the research and reading a lot of the things you've done in the past, also, I see that you've got great compassion for families going through the heartache and the anxiety that fussy eating causes to children and their parents. So, initially, also, I'd love to know what are some of the most common challenges parents of fussy eaters like what do they experience, and what are those sort of more common challenges?
I think you probably can find two categories of parents here. The ones who struggle with a child from pretty much from birth, and there can be a multitude of reasons for that. And these children, these babies, will struggle to perhaps feed, breastfeed, or bottle feed, or they will really struggle to tackle solids. And then there's another category, and these children have been perfect little eaters until they reach the age of about 18 months to 2 years of age. So all parents then go through a challenging time, because it is often that dinner, meal times happens to be at later on in the evening when people are tired, kids are tired, so it puts a lot of stress on the family. The challenges are numerous, because we pay a lot of attention to what our kids are eating, of course.
So fussy eating actually presents at quite a young age. This is not something that kids necessarily develop whilst they're in primary school and or toddlers. This is something you're mentioning. They are sort of from either from birth and or from I guess as a I don't know. Is it from a toddler?
Yes, from a toddler. So I think it's usually a good indication of what is going on. If it started really early on in life, then I'll be tempted to look at a range of issues, including medical. Did the child have reflux? Do I need to refer the child to a speech language pathologist to really check their ability to process food in their mouth? So after the age of 18 months, or if there has been no prior issue, then I would be looking at development, perfectly normal development of a child, which is food neophobia, when kids then start to become a lot wary of what they're eating because they're more cognizant. That to me is less of a concern, but however, it can spiral down into a really tricky, complicated feeding life for the parents. And they might really lose track of feeding their children in a manner that's quite responsive.
And in your experience, what have been some of the more common sensory food aversions children who are fussy eaters have to different foods? I mean, some of them we've heard, for example, they don't like food too hot or too mushy, or it's cold, slippery, all those types of things. But what are some of the more common sensory food aversions that you've sort of found?
So in the field, we tend to look at sensory aversions. Obviously, all of us coexist on a sensory spectrum, if you like. So I have myself quite a few sensory specificities, I would call them. I might be really triggered by noise. I can be triggered by smells. So, and that's really good for me to actually understand how children may be really triggered by a smell, even the appearance of a specific food. And I will definitely pay attention to that. Whether it's important to think that we can overcome most of these sensory specificities that we have, otherwise we would be stuck eating the same food for all of our lives. But what you see perhaps is with children who are on the spectrum, these are actually more important sensitivities. And this may take a lot of time and a lot of working with food progressions for them to become more comfortable. What you want to do is to equip these children with skills so that they can manage the sensory difficulties. So typically, if the smell is an issue, you want to be able for them to work out what to do about the smell. It may be that, if they're cooking with you, we open the window or we use the exhaust fan. So you always have to try to accommodate for these sensory aversions or difficulties, but you do want to create still an opportunity for them to overcome them bit by bit.
Yes.
And then there are obviously people who specialize in these, so OTs and SLPs, occupational therapists, and speech language pathologists who will look into that. Some of them will do feeding therapy. Personally, it's not something that I do, but I do see children who have done feeding therapy before. So my view is to work with the family to really develop a responsive type of feeding in the house, because that's the hardest to actually accomplish, for everyone to be enjoying their feeding and eating experience, for the parents and for the kids.
Okay, well, let's speak a little bit more about that in just a moment. Initially, we published your article, and the title is Stop Fussy Eating, Driving You to the Edge of Reason. So for someone who hasn't yet read the article, can you please tell us what it's about and what inspired you to write it?
There were several things that inspired me to write it. One was the fact that a lot of people who end up on my website have been searching for recipes for fussy eating children, as if there is such a thing as a fussy eating recipe that is going to
fix
do
everything,
magic for you. It doesn't happen that way, unfortunately. And the second thing that really triggered me to write this was a family I worked with who had been doing feeding therapy for years, and their child was about 4 years of age. And so their dinner table was a therapy session, and they were exhausted. When we talked about how we could perhaps change the ways things were happening around the dinner table, and they were thankful. They had enough. They had been doing this for years. It was exhausting, the whole singing along as their child ate something, praising their child as he ate something, trying to play, role play with the father, Daddy ate his carrot so he can see in the dark. It was just, interesting to see them like that, but also in a way saddening, because I felt like they didn't really have a family time. It was a therapy session at dinner.
Yes. So are you saying that parents are making things harder for themselves when it comes to managing a fussy eater? And if so, if this is the case, how is this so then?
So I think it's very hard not to fall into the trap of making things harder for you, because you are desperate. You really want to get this food in. You really want to get your child to eat some nutritious food. So I understand that parents are driven to using all sorts of tools and tips. And on the internet, there are different approaches to what I do and what other people do in the field.
Sure.
So we take a bias and a particular philosophy and we go and run with it. In my experience, making things complicated for you is only going to make things worse, particularly if you start catering. So in the article, I talked about, moms who end up plating for the kids, doing art in the plate, or
Yeah, I've seen that.
yeah, it's lovely, but at the end of the day, it's really saying to me that we're trying to get this piece of cucumber eaten so badly. And perhaps the other approach would be just to be cooking food that's comfortable to the palate of a child. It doesn't have to be bland, but it has to have some sort of a cooking method, perhaps that brings the sugars out, like a roasting method, or cooking an Asian recipe for vegetables. Or it may be that you are looking at ways to, or adding fat simply because it will make food more palatable. So comfort food or family food, in my view, is probably a good starting point. And usually you can actually tweak it so that it satisfies everyone, but then you end up only cooking one meal. You may put your spices on the side for the adults if they want to add a lot of spices. It's all feasible within the range of family meals, and in a way that simplifies everybody's life.
So what would you recommend parents do then if there's no such thing as a recipe for fussy eaters? What are you suggesting? Is anything else in particular?
Well, I would recommend that they work out whether they need some help or not. So typically, if the child is really eating very well, if until they've hit food neophobia stage, which is a developmental stage, then I would say you may be able to get through this. However, I think most parents know if they need help because they can see this is affecting their daily routine. And, it's 3 meals a day. So if it's 3 times a day that you are really anxious about how feeding is going in your own family, then it may be time to seek help. So if you do not seek professional help and you do not need it, there's plenty of advice, including on my website, that will get you somewhere. And I would say to you, if you can, think about having about 20 dishes and start rolling them. And these 20 dishes should represent what your family meal or feeding culture is all about. For the other category of people that need help, then I would say seek the help. Yet I would still give the advice of developing a range of foods that you deem fine and suitable for your family, and I would advocate that you start serving them. So in a way that enables your children to be exposed to them.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that your children go to bed hungry. It doesn't mean that we're here to make lives more difficult for children. Quite the contrary. So in a dish that's challenging for kids, you may have a side that's less challenging.
Yeah.
So in other words, you are providing some form of exposure to the family eating culture, but still having either some staples on the table.
Yes.
So either some bread or perhaps some rice or pasta, that's part of the dish.
Yes.
But that's not too challenging.
And I wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier on. But why do you say that parents are not their child's therapist? I just wanted to go back to that point, if we could.
Well, I think parents are the child's expert. Like, parents know their child best. That's what is so important. And part of this expertise will lead them to do some research and work out a way of simplifying things or solving problems. That's perfectly fine. And I think parents are definitely the experts of their child. But a therapist is different. And a therapist, I mean, you know, I'm not a psychologist. I understand that if I go and seek help with a therapist, they're going to help me out. But then I go home, I'm not going to be doing therapy on my children just because the psychologist has taught me a few things about myself.
Yes.
In the same manner, in particular with regards to feeding therapy, it doesn't require you to go home and keep the same approach that your therapist has in the clinic. And I simply think it is just not conducive to good eating, because if you start doing therapy at home, you're bound to apply some sort of pressure in feeding. And children, they get it, you know, they hear you praise them along or praise dad as he's eating a carrot. They know exactly what you're after. They know that you're after them eating the carrot.
Yeah.
And so that's a form of pressure. And it doesn't matter how you disguise it. They'll sense it, they'll know it, and they, you know,
They'll
most
feed off
likely
it.
will push back.
Yeah. Well, what emotions are common for parents with fussy eaters to feel? What have you found?
It's interesting, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of anxiety, but that you may have heard, and stress. But there's also a lot of shame. And I've talked to many parents who say they are, in a way, ashamed to take their child out to family or friends. They are wary of comments that people might come up with regards to their child's weight, the fact that they are limited with the foods that they will eat. So shame is a big deal. And concern and worry, you know, what if my child doesn't develop as well as they could? What if they're not getting the nutrients they need? It's important to know that nutritional deficiencies are quite rare in Australia, but they can happen with children who are really extremely fussy and who are eating a limited number of food groups.
And I wanted to ask you about guilt, because you mentioned this in your article. I mean, how can guilt trigger parents to make wrong decisions with fussy eaters?
Well, I think I was particularly referring to the fact that it's a bit of a downward spiral, isn't it? Kids don't eat, so now you start to feel so guilty. You end up cooking a second meal or third meal. In some families, that's the case to accommodate everyone's different tastes. Or you end up spending hours, you know, plating and shaping foods. So the guilt here is about having a child who's not eating, and you're thinking it's all about it's all your fault and whatever you're putting on the table, but that is not what's caused the fussy eating in the first place. So if you understand the reasons of fussy eating, if you understand where your child is and whether they need some help, then that should help you tackle the guilt.
I was going to ask,
and the guilt is not going to take you anywhere that's satisfying, really.
No. Is there anything else that parents can do to reduce their guilt besides just understanding what their children's what's
being a parent? You have inherent guilt about the things that you didn't do, the things you could have done better. My kids are grown up, and there isn't one day when I think about back in the days when I did this or that, and I still feel guilty about it. So I think it is inherent to parenting. But when it comes to feeding kids, because it's such a repetitive thing and we do it 3 times a day at least, then it takes a toll on us throughout the years. And so it would be better if we could avoid this and really having family meals that you put in the center of the table, having a main and some side options, perhaps a second course of yogurt or cheese and bread and fruit or dessert will suffice for children to find something that they can eat while they grow, being exposed to a variety of food that you deem is fine. And then one day they will start tackling the food because you have been patient and you have provided a positive eating experience.
Yes. Now, in your article, you also speak about the division of responsibility. So what is this and how can parents apply it to help them?
So I think that is the best piece of advice you will find in the field. And it comes from Ellen Satter. She is the reference for anyone who is working in this, or is interested in this field. Basically, and she's in America. So I think in America, they started to approach feeding issues from a behavioral point of view years ago. They would take the kids out of the house and to the clinic to sort them out. But of course, they would go home and still not eat. And then you'd have parents who were under pressure, who would then pressurize their children. So I think Ellen Satter quickly understood that this was not the way to go. This was producing parents who were really unhappy and children who were really unhappy. The division of responsibility is really that saying that there's two jobs. There's the parents' jobs and the kids' jobs. I can say I'm really lucky that I grew up in a culture that does promote exactly that. And I grew up in a family that was just exactly like that. They put the food on the table. We were able to eat or not to eat. And we didn't have any pressure. So the parents' job is to provide the food. That's not the child's choice. They can't say that they want chicken nuggets every day. The parents have to think about what it is that they want their kids to eat. You know, their kid is not going to be 4 years old for all of their life. So will they just be exposed to chicken nuggets? No, perhaps not. Perhaps you you like curries, you like a variety of food. So what's the range of food you want to expose your child to? That's your job. That's your responsibility. That's the when you provide the food, obviously at a time when that is reasonable, that has when you have a gap between meals so that at least kids are hungry when they come to the table. And the where is at the table rather than feeding kids anywhere and everywhere.
So
the kids' job really is different. Sorry. The kids' job is really to decide if they want to eat the food and how much they want to eat the food, how much they want to eat.
So what difference would a parent be likely to see if they applied this division of responsibility correctly then?
Well, they would create a positive feeding environment and eating environment for their child. That's one. But it takes time and it's the hardest job to do. So it sounds really simple, but many people struggle with that, and they find themselves in a predicament thinking it doesn't work. So it does work, but it's long term. I think the best way to think about that is to think about when we were children, what we ate. I don't know about you, but I think, I had severe limitations in many ways for a French girl. And I didn't like vegetables. I remember that. But eventually there is a time, an age, when you will eat a vegetable that's been steamed and, you will drizzle a bit of olive oil and you'll go, wow, this is amazing.
Something changes in the palate.
So to get from childhood to this takes a lot of time, a lot of practice. And it's important to bear that in mind. It doesn't happen overnight.
So in saying that, how can parents provide their fussy eaters with variations that they need to expand their child's food repertoire then? Do you have any advice?
So I think, I was going to talk to you about the example of when we were little kids in France. Certainly we would eat very bitter vegetables. And if they were provided in the gratin, that would take the bitterness away. So, you may have to look at ways, as I've said, to cook that so as to make the food more palatable for kids. That's one. And then with food, you have to think about how kids understand it. So I would say if they are really comfortable with eating sausages, let's say that's the example I've got in mind, can you come up with 3 or 4 recipes and use the sausage, so a good quality sausage in these recipes? So it may be that you will practice these recipes so that the component is always the sausage they're comfortable with, but it's come with a plate of lentils or it's come with a plate of pasta. I actually have some recipes on my website that do just that, that aim to put that food in a different context so that the kids become more familiar and understand the concept of this particular food being used differently.
And do you
Typically,
find
there's
that
also
method,
things like,
I was just going to say, do you find that that method then gives children the ability to be able to expand their palate and food repertoire even further, because they become familiar, they say, okay, great, I'm okay with that sausage and I like that sausage, and they're maybe more likely to eat that, like you said, with lentils or however you are expanding their palate around the foods that they are comfortable with. So that's the technique that you're I guess suggesting for families to use then?
I would say it's one of the techniques that they can use to make their child more familiar with other foods that
Other foods.
surround this basic accepted food that their child has.
Yeah.
And then there are things, you want to look at the degree at which you mix foods together. If a child is comfortable with a particular food, you
Mm-hmm.
may want them to be involved in the mixing of this food. So typically pasta bolognese may become one of the foods that they used to eat and they don't want to eat anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to involve them in building that dish together, perhaps back at the bench in the kitchen, and mix it together until they eventually get the confidence to tuck in. But before they do that, they may do a very light mix of it so that when it comes to the table, they'll be able to retrieve the spaghettis without the sauce on it. So there are ways to build confidence around food and exposure that are definitely important with those children who are really stuck. But with other kids who are not as who don't have such a complicated relationship with food, a simple exposure will do it. And these kids don't need anyone like me to work with the family.
Yes. And I wanted to ask you also, how can changing the conversation at dinner time help with fussy eaters? And in particular, do you have any questions that parents could be asking their kids to deter, I guess, their concentration just being on the food, maybe?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I find a lot of parents will have these endless conversations at mealtime about, what the child is eating. They will, they will praise their child for eating. They will argue with their child with regards to eating. So of course, that's always going to backfire. Their child may also have meltdown. They may really lose it at the table at meal times. So that's really disheartening for parents. So is there anything that we can do prior to being at the table? Can we make sure that the kids come relaxed and see that they can actually find something that they're going to eat on the table? And can we then build the conversation around something that's a positive? I
Mm-hmm.
like and I do have that on my website, and I've talked about it on yours in the blog post. I like to talk about building resilient children. The research suggests that you can actually do that at the dinner table. And the reason is simple. At the dinner table, if you talk to your children and you talk to them about your family, about where you come from, you give them a grounding that's really going to last a lifetime. And that's shown to actually help build resilience. So why not build the conversation around who you are, why you chose their name, why, where you went to school, who your parents are, what your grandparents did, where they came from, etc., etc. These questions were, as I say, I've got them on my website. There are 20 questions that were written by a researcher called Duke. I think it's Michael Duke. I think they're great to be used to build conversation for at meal times, and they can be adapted to any age.
Yes, and there's a link in the article through to this page on your website. Now, of course, that would be age appropriate depending on the age of the child, but I consider see that they are very open-ended questions. Do you know where your mother grew up? Do you know where your father grew up? Do you know where some of your grandparents grew up? These types of questions that you're speaking about that anchor down to the history of the family. different questions, sort of scrolling down some of them. Do you know which person in the family you act most like? Lots of these questions. And as you said, they are sort of tailored to be able to build resilience. Is that right?
That's certainly what the researchers said, that when the kids were able to answer these questions, they were shown to be more resilient. So they had a more positive outlook on life, and they were able to manage. I mean, really, during the time of COVID, this is something we should all consider, how do we raise resilient children?
And how about families with younger children? Talking about age-appropriate questions, what else would you sort of suggest for a family with the preschoolers or toddlers to help sort of
I think, yeah,
yeah.
I think it's the hardest time with toddlers and preschoolers, because if you're an adult, you may end up on your mobile phone because you just want to have an adult time. So I wonder whether you can think about when your adult time should be, and perhaps it is when your child is in bed, so that you can actually face them during meal times, and if possible, and I think that's the best, it at the same time. But it may be just about, what the plan is. So kids, they need a lot of structure, and they need to know what comes next. So it may be about what is happening next, and next maybe nap, and next after nap time, maybe a walk in the park. So it's about talking about little activities. But hey, I remember being a mum with young kids at that age, and the park bored me. It was very difficult. You feel very lonely. So talking about family and things that you're going to do, activities, is probably a safe bet, safe way to go.
To them. And do you generally find that when you do sort of sway the conversation away from the food and the pressure of eating the food does generally help children to be able to consume more?
What I've certainly seen in my experience, not only with my kids, but with families that I work with, once you've managed to remove yourself a little bit from that arguing about the food, or that, for that child to be able to come down and relax and process what the food is that is being served at the table, then invariably they're going to be happier. And some of them are actually going to try the food with time. So you'll be surprised that it actually benefits eating, rather than the techniques you've used in the past.
And I also wanted to ask you, in your opinion, do you think that providing children with regular exposure to foods that they dislike is actually advantageous for fussy eaters? The fact that they see the food more often, have you found that generally can sort of help them over time, sort of help them to be able to, I don't know, become more familiar with the foods and be more likely to try them?
So with dislikes, it's very particular, isn't it? How can you be sure that you establish a strong dislike, as opposed to establishing that the fact that the child is really lacking the exposure? But I'll give you one example, which is capsicums in our family. I have my youngest daughter, who was a bit of a fussy eating child in the past. She'll eat anything now, but capsicum, I can say clearly, is not one food that she raves about. But I've always cooked with it. I've always used it. So in other words, I've always felt that if I want to serve it, if I want to cook it, then I'm still going to serve it. And so I noticed it 2 nights ago that she put some capsicum on the side of her plate. Then I did meet a 27-year-old young man a few years ago, who said to me that his mom always cooked capsicums. And it was only now, at 27 years of age, that he found he actually liked them a lot.
Wow.
So you have to give it time. Exposure is key, but it's part of the dish. Can my child put it on the side? Yeah. He's happy, I'm happy. We move on. We don't have to.
What have you found
argue
actually
about the fact? Yeah.
Causes that change in palate? Like, what is it that all of a sudden a child, they've disliked a food for a certain amount of time, and then all of a sudden they just wake up, it's a sunny day and a Tuesday, and they're like, all of a sudden, I want to eat carrots. I've never eaten carrots before, but today I want to, and now I like them.
And look, there can be a bit of a genetic component. We haven't really talked about that. And some people will be more sensitive to smell. Some people will be more sensitive to bitterness. So bitterness is the big deal here. We're born liking sweetness. as human beings. Breast milk is sweet, easy. And then you can move on to something that's savory, salty, really easy to acquire. Then you can move on to something that's sour. You'll see babies, doing this funny face when they just had a bite of lemon, but it's fairly easy to manage. Bitterness, on the other hand, takes time. In capsicum, there's a bit more than bitterness. There's also a bit of pepper, it's quite peppery. So it takes time to acquire the skills and the taste. But, we're not born liking wine or coffee or beer. I still don't like beer, so it tells me that bitterness is not my forte. Having said that, I didn't like wine either when I was younger, but with practice, I've come to like it better. So we can enjoy bitterness as we practice it more. And there's also a really cultural element about food and how we deal with smells and appearance. We just have to transport ourselves into another country, smell the food, see what people eat, and really understand that this is key in our acceptance of food. So I have given you the example of snails before, but if I can eat snails, the reason I can do that is that I was introduced to them when I was really a kid, but in an environment that's pleasant and cheerful, Christmas time,
So it anchors down to a positive
goes
emotion.
a long way to say, pardon?
It anchors to a positive emotion. So there's the correlation between that food and a positive emotion. Yes.
Absolutely. And we're all there, we remember grandma's special dish, special pie. And so it's associated often to a moment. Actually, the experience of eating is really interesting. There's a lot of research into that. And so do people remember the dish? Yeah, kind of, but they remember the ambiance. Any famous chefs these days, it goes well beyond the food. What they provide you is with an experience.
It's the lighting, it's the feel, it's the mood. Yes,
exactly. You'll appreciate apparently better a pizza if you are in a restaurant where there's Italian music playing and it's a very pleasant moment. Then you'll go home having the same ingredients, thinking I'm going to have this pizza again, and then
I'm going to recreate that experience.
But it's not happening. It can never happen the same. You cannot have this experience because simply you're not having these environmental elements. For anyone interested in this, it's called neurogastronomy. There are people who are researching this really seriously.
That's fascinating. Yeah, we'd have another chat about that in the future. And I just wanted to ask you also, we do have in some states and territories around Australia, not all, of course, as we know at the moment, in lockdown, and parents are busy homeschooling. But for the kids that are back at school at the moment, I'd love to know, do you have any lunchbox tips to help fussy eaters eat more at lunchtime?
So what, again, I see typically with extreme fussy eaters, including children who have ADHD or are on the spectrum, is that the range of food is so limited that people will pack a lot of foods, a lot of snacks in the box, desperate that the kids will eat something. So I would say you have to rethink this strategy of having too many dishes in the lunchbox, too much packaging. It takes a lot of time. Kids start fidgeting around with the food and the unpacking, and that takes too much time. By the time they're done, they are really running out of time to have their lunch. So reduce the packaging perhaps at home, or reduce the snacks in quantity.
The amount,
and
yes.
try, to have what you would consider regular lunch food, like a sandwich, even if the kids don't necessarily tackle it, but a regular sandwich. And then a fruit, perhaps some cheese, and a variety, so that you can have several food groups.
But to do a lot of the unpacking at home, so that the children have more time to eat, as opposed to less time to having to
and less choice, frankly.
Yes.
Too much choice and too much packaging is really confusing to children.
Yes.
They don't know anything about food. You have to be in charge, and that is the division of responsibility. You are in charge of the food because you know best. know
Yes.
better than they.
Hmm. This has been a great chat, and as we were just saying, parents of fussy eaters know all too well the challenges and the frustrations with pleasing, various palates of each and every one of their family members, as you were saying earlier on, and things like extended meal preparation times and having to cook 2 or 3 different meals, as you mentioned earlier on, and of course the disappointment if the foods aren't well received. There's so many challenges that families of fussy eaters have, and I have no doubt the information that you've shared with us today is going to assist families in their challenges. If you were to summarize, I guess, your key messages for anyone watching and listening today, what would they be?
My key messages would be to work out whether your child and you need some help or not. So that would be the first thing. If you find that you need some help, don't wait. Don't turn around in 2 or 3 or 4 years and think, oh gosh, I should have done it. Do it
Mhm.
now because it compounds. So when I see older children and when it's been going on in the family for years, it's a lot more difficult. And by then, everyone's exhausted and stressed out, and the kids are likely to be really stuck and anxious. So that would be the first one. Don't wait. And then the second advice is to go for simple, really think family food, put the food in the middle of the table, relax, bring the conversation to other topics that bring joy to the table. Be, in a way, take the responsibility at heart that you have to provide the variety, you have to provide the food that will enhance the kids' ability to become familiar
Mhm.
with the particular food.
And if parents have got any other questions for you and or want to reach out, whereabouts can they find you?
So they can find me on www.fussyeater.com.au. It says it all. I'm actually running an online group for parents who have fussy eating children from August the 24th. It runs every Monday
Mhm.
at 1 p.m. And at the moment, if people book, they will get an early bird price. So it's the time.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, there's a lot of information on my website.
Wonderful. I'll have all of those links in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today, Marie-France, and can't wait to chat with you
Hey,
again soon.
thanks, Rachel.
Take care.
So good to speak to you. Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Okay, bye.